focus on humanity during the rule of the Medici family at Florence had helped to create a newfound freedom that was infectious. The movement did not necessarily reject the idea of God, but rather questioned humankind's relationship to God. And this idea caused an unprecedented upheaval in the previously understood social hierarchy and gave everyone the right to be inquisitive about the world around them. Donato Bramante, 1444 to 1514, started his working life as a painter in Milan, working on one of the most remarkable Greek cross churches of the Renaissance period, Santa Maria presso San Satiro. Bramante had a great gift for scenography, and that made his drawings and paintings powerful and persuasive tools, advancing his architectural ideas, and this allowed his clients to imagine themselves in a Bramante-esque setting, and he used geometric form and spatial definition to bring about a building of massive sculptural form. As the Cinquecento began, his plan for the Tempetto of San Pietro in Montorio, 1502, was put into place. Above a crypt raised on a step base is an extremely small centrally planned room. Above this in turn a tambour with many openings. The unique building was surrounded by columns, crowned by a dome and lantern. It has had alterations over the years, but more or less remains faithful to his original concept. What he did was recreate a round temple using Vitruvius as his guide, together with his study of the archaeological remains of the temples of Hercules Victor and Vesta at Rome as sources. In the process, Bramante rediscovered the classical technique of cladding brickwork in stucco to look like stone. Building in stone was important to many patrons because it reflected high status. Bramante's invention enabled wealthy employers to have facades that look like stone to most people, but were built at an economical price. All great Renaissance architects were striving to achieve harmony in the design of their buildings. Michelangelo di Lodovici Buonarroti, 1475 to 1564, skillfully grouped buildings together using sculpture in groups and also staircases to draw his spectators into an organized space. As an architect, he reacted against pure classicism, setting columns back into the walls using classical elements such as brackets as a distinctive decorative and individual gesture rather than as a means of support. This unique Mannerist style would lay the foundations for the development and later flowering of a more fully developed 17th century style, now known as the Baroque. Giulio Romano had been the Pope's chosen architect to extend St. Peter's Basilica at Rome, but he died, and contrary to all expectations, Michelangelo at 72 was commissioned by Pope Julius II to complete the work. The original design included a centralized Greek cross, expressing its function as a place of martyrdom. However, this was not a suitable form for the liturgical functions of the church, so Michelangelo transformed it into a Latin cross, and the nave and facade were added later by Modena in 1607 to 1674. To save time and cost, Michelangelo adapted a plan that Bramante had put forward in 1505 to 6 with his pupil Raphael. The outside of the building was raised to the height where the dome rises above the tambour, and Michelangelo sent off to Florence for the plans of Brunelleschi's dome to help him plan the dome for St. Peter's, using it as a starting point to work out his own solutions. The dome of St. Peter's today dominates the Roman skyline, and if you have the courage, you can climb 537 steps to the lantern on the top for an inspirational view. Inside, Michelangelo used frescoes to highlight the architectural grandeur of the dome, taking the eye ever upwards to the glory of God, to whom the great structure was dedicated. From the beginning of the 15th century onward, the inhabitants of Rome had been greeted by the sight of brightly dressed bands of hunters riding out from the city to the nearby domains where the nephew of Pope Sixtus IV, Count Girolamo Raiaro, hosted spectacular hunting parties. During the early years of the 16th century, Humanist Pope Leo X was also someone who enjoyed the hunt. He appreciated its meticulously planned ceremonial aspects, as the passion for hunting continued unabated. The Villa Lante was Cardinal Gambo's summer retreat, built on the slopes of Monte Sant'Angelo. It was originally surrounded by a great wooded area, accommodating a game reserve. Completed in 1573, it remains truer to its original form than any other Italian garden of the period. The natural element is water tamed by man, its multiple resources exploited in ingenious ways. Box hedges are laid out in the traditional geometric composition of an Italian parterre. Its special quality is that the park and garden are intimately related, the Renaissance ideal. The plants were described as being suitable for different areas of the garden. Elms in rows were 7 aside, cherry laurel and plane trees, and higher up more plane trees with a grove of arbutus, known at the time as Ceres marine, and evergreen oaks. Farther up still, fir trees surrounded by juniper and myrtle, and still another little wood of pomegranates and quinces, and higher still, oak woods and olive trees, and on the sunny slope, peaches. For nearly 2 centuries, the rest of Europe looked with admiration to Italy as the interpreter of the garden tradition from the ancient world. The main characteristic of gardens from this time would be that the elements of design, form, and style would be far more important than the plants themselves, of which only a very limited range were used, and then only as an evergreen sort of architecture. This neglect of flowers in a garden may give the impression that there was no delight or interest in flowers, when in fact there was. It is said that the Renaissance discovered the natural world, and Renaissance artists studied flowers and plants intensely. Until the 1560s, most plants used in Western medicine and grown in both useful and ornamental gardens were species indigenous to Europe. Those from farther afield were native to the countries of the Mediterranean basin. However, new political context meant that new plants gradually began to arrive, giving impetus to the study of medicine by physicians, and to its logical offshoot, the development of a new botanical science. The earliest official botanical gardens in Europe were established in Italy during the 16th century. They were attached to the School of Botany and Medicine at both Pisa and Padua universities, where studies had descended from the cloister medicinal gardens or the physic gardens of the Middle Ages, adapted on ideas from the Muslim tradition. As catalogues of medicinal plants developed, so too did a need for producing more exacting drawings. Foremost among the Italian flower illustrators was Leonardo da Vinci, whose interest can genuinely be called scientific. He dissected plants to observe how they were formed, his curiosity insatiable, repeatedly writing in his notes, "Who will tell me if anything was ever finished?" His drawings were so accurate, and his keen and informed eye helped show the way for future illustrators of botany, and sent a loud and clear message that for him direct observation was the only path to truth. Renaissance Europe provided a setting in which scholars and gardeners could experiment with and communicate about growing and acclimatizing new plants. Clean and cool air, views over landscapes, the green of nature, its flora and fauna, an easier rhythm of life. These were all available to you in your villa in the countryside. In 1560, courtier and humanist Annibale Caro, who spent most of his life in service to the Farnese family, wrote, "I have taken a vineyard at Frascati. He said, I enjoy and restore myself on this air greatly, and what is more important is that I seem to have found the alchemy of staying well." The seasons dictated the movement to the town from the country for the winter. That usually happened in November, as a report from Padua of 1445 said. It had been impossible to get a quorum for a meeting of the Great Council, because the vintage is now on. Almost all of the citizens of Padua belonging to the Great Council are to be found in villas in order to see their vintages. A Renaissance nobleman envisaged his villa as a study, its landscape as a desert, and himself as a sage. He wanted to enjoy a pastoral allegory in a scene where the music young men played and sang was so beautiful that the nymphs came out to play, listen, and join in. Andrea di Pietro della Gondola, later known as Andrea Palladio, 1508 to 1580, was born in the Veneto at a time when the benefits of country living were becoming more and more apparent. Extended peace allowed the building of more and more villas, and we could say that Palladio was born at the right time in the right place for providing a new style of architecture to suit his patron's new ideals. He became an avid student of the first century Roman architect Vitruvius and grew to understand that all the different aspects of proportion in architecture needed to relate to the human body, which had a symmetrical harmony of its own. He reinterpreted Vitruvius's ancient measurements, exploring many different ratios to achieve pleasing results. He turned to antiquity to produce his buildings less as a model than as a key to the harmonic language that would create the perfect balance between culture and taste. He also believed that the study of ancient remains was the power and moral force behind Roman civilization. His beautiful San Giorgio Maggiore in the city of Venice is still used for worship and represents one of the architect's greatest achievements as an application of his principles concerning the relationship between architecture, the environment, and humankind. Palladio published his 4 books of architecture in 1570 at Venice, where he grew up, and it provided illustrations of the classical orders, some of the most important buildings of antiquity, and a range of his own works in plan and elevation and section, many of which appeared on par with those from antiquity. Still a focal point of public life at Vicenza in the Veneto, the basilica that Palladio built proved he was sensitive to the problems associated with the aesthetics of corners, using 3 engaged columns to turn the corners at each end of the building. This technique had the added advantage of buttressing or supporting the structure above. He used the Doric order on the arcades with cylindrical bases, and on the upper floor he used the Ionic order, adding an extra fascia or band of stone under the balcony to make it more visible from below. One of Palladio's most interesting buildings is the Teatro Olimpico, also at Vicenza. This unique theatre was a faithful homage to Roman architect Vitruvius, and the stage utilises some quite magical effects. He banked it steeply so that from the audience the streets on stage appear to vanish into the distance, an illusionistic idea still used today by both stage and film producers. The theatre was inscribed within a circle in which 4 equilateral triangles defined the exits, the size of the stage and orchestra, and other important features. According to Palladio, houses from antiquity were built without decoration. The raison d'etre of the villas he built in the Veneto was the reclamation of the countryside, in which the villa owner, in his role of divine padrone, occupied the central position. Palladio, like his clients, believed the country was valuable, above all for the recreation it provided. The word recreation meaning in its widest sense refreshment, relaxation, play, exercise, and restitution of mind, body, and soul. He took it for granted that all gentlemen possessed 2 houses, one in the city and another in the country, commuting from one to the other seasonally or as they wished. His villa designs were meant to be utilised in many different combinations, to meet the needs and wishes of his clients. He reworked the forms of antiquity into a contemporary domestic formula, while accommodating his patrons' need for economy by building their villas in rough brickwork and facing them with stucco. Palladio's buildings have been the subject of scholarly study in the 4 centuries since his death in 1589. They differ from villas elsewhere in Italy because of the circumstances which determined their function, that is, a renewed interest in farming coinciding with contemporary treatises on agriculture. It was difficult to conceive of anything more virtuous than money earned by tilling the land. At the Villa Cornaro, restoration late last century restored the special formula of paint he had originally used, which was a mixture of pulverized marble, brick powder and stucco together to restore its facade. Its 2-story central portico-style loggia arrangement opens the villa up to a prospect of the countryside as well as the cooling summer breezes. On the interior, his symmetrical floor plan has rooms of different sizes and shapes, flanking a central axis which runs throughout the house. In the main sala, on the ceiling rendered under Palladio's supervision, is incredible hand-painted work which has been conserved. In this space he introduced interior Ionic columns to support the beam ceiling, the hall itself resembling his reconstruction of a hall in the Egyptian style, first described by Vitruvius and used in ancient Egypt at the Temple of Luxor. At La Malcontenta for the Foscari family, he thought out all the problems of the site, creating a retreat whose entrance floor was up high so that it could cope with flooding from the adjacent river Brenta. Palladio's villa designs exhibited graceful restraint, and he enjoyed the idea of happening upon a vista accidentally. The garden, the villa, its outbuildings, pathways and vistas were all a complete environment, and the gardens were grassed or gravelled so that they did not impede the view from the villa or of it. High hedges and rows of trees camouflaged the kitchen gardens. The garden, house and landscape linked to each other in an aestheticization of the view. Vistas from the loggia and hall were channeled along avenues toward the landscape which, with its villa, formed a single architectural structure. The road, an element of his plan, an environment in itself, shaded by trees. The objective was to see and be seen. At the Villa Barbaro at Messer, responding to the needs of his esteemed patrons and clients, the scholarly Barbaro brothers, Palladio designed a classical central section with an attached pair of agricultural wings. At each end he placed dovecots, catering to the old tradition of attracting fowl to the Lord's table. In the countryside, the Barbaro brothers enjoyed their literary pursuits. Inside the villa, the entrance hall was 2 stories high. The upper floor, the ceiling decorated by Paolo Veronese between 1560 and 1562. Daniel Barbaro could enjoy the view over the orchards of the estate and watch his people at work, and if he turned around he could enjoy an illusionistic fresco that extended the vistas of the room. Through a door in the rear of the central salon, he could step out onto the terrace which was set against the hillside and inset with an elegant nymphaeum, a grotto fountain, rich with figural imagery. This symbolic evocation of the ancient world served important functional uses. There is a fountain cut into the mountain opposite the house, with infinite ornaments of stucco and paintings. The fountain forms a small lake, which serves for a fish pond, wrote Palladio. From this place the water runs into the kitchen, and after having watered the gardens that are on the right and left of the road which leads gradually to the fabric, it forms 2 fish ponds, with their watering places upon the high road, from whence it waters the kitchen gardens, which are very large and full of the most excellent fruits. Its main emphasis lay on the functional significance of the pool in the water circulation of the complex, and on the fertility of the kitchen gardens and orchards, which emphasised the agrarian connotations of the villa, which, because of its grandeur, might have been pushed into the background. Finally, when he'd completed the villa and its outbuildings, he built a chapel outside the villa walls so that the villagers could also use it. "Today," said the 3rd Earl of Burlington in the 18th century, "I have seen a splendid villa called La Rotunda on a beautiful hill. Maybe art has never before reached such a level of magnificence." From 1566 to 1570, Palladio constructed a summer residence for the papal prelate Paolo Almerica outside Vicenza, sited on a hill looking out from 4 matching facades. It stands against the landscape set at a 45-degree angle to the north, so that all 4 facades of the house would receive some sunshine each day. He also took into account how it was approached, so that as you drive towards it even today, the villa is only revealed gradually. The Villa Capra or Villa Rotunda was not intended to be a grand house, but a suburban pleasure house within easy reach of Vicenza, to be used for parties or recreation, as Palladio put it. The site is as pleasant and delightful as can be found, because it is on a small hill of very easy access, and is watered on one side by the Bacchiglione, a navigable river, and on the other it is accompanied with most pleasant rising, which looks like a very great theatre, and are all cultivated, and abound with excellent fruits and most exquisite vines, some of which are limited, some more extended, and others that terminate with the horizon. This villa did not have an agricultural function, but Palladio placed it in the landscape with the utmost care. By walking around it, you can understand that he intended it to be the vista from wherever you approach it, but at no single point does it lose touch with the wooded slopes of Monte Berico. Today, the villa is one of the most evocative symbols of the spirit of Tuscany and the Italian Renaissance, all rolled into one. When we have run our passion's heat, love hither makes his best retreat. The gods that mortal beauty chase, still in a tree, did end their race. Apollo hunted Daphne so, only that she might laurel grow, and Pan did after Syrinx speed, not as a nymph, but for a reed. Lo, where the rosy bosomed hours fair Venus' train appear, disclose the long expecting flowers, and wake the purple year. The world's great age begins anew. The golden years return.